What began as a fiery argument escalated into an all-out collapse. Greg Gutfeld's unfiltered retort proved too much for her to bear. The studio lights shone brightly overhead, casting a stark glow on everything below. The air was heavy with an unspoken energy, almost palpable, sharp, electric, and buzzing with anticipation. This wasn't just another late-night television episode. Something in the atmosphere suggested it could become one of those rare moments when a debate transcends its usual boundaries, leaving a lasting impression. Greg Gutfeld, as always, was at the heart of it all. Seated comfortably behind the desk, his trademark smirk masked how much he thrived on the tension. Years of honing his craft had taught him how to challenge anyone, liberal or conservative, with a cool, collected demeanor and a razor-sharp wit. He understood the art of timing, knowing when to strike for maximum impact, and how to keep the audience captivated. Across from him sat Rachel, a well-known liberal commentator who had built her reputation on passionate opinions and tackling contentious issues head-on. Tonight, however, something felt off. The usual spark in her eyes seemed dimmed. She shifted in her seat, glancing nervously at the teleprompter, as if searching for an anchor to steady her growing unease. Every move was deliberate, but beneath the surface, Greg sensed a rare vulnerability, subtle but unmistakable. She had no idea what was coming. Greg surveyed the scene with a faint, almost imperceptible smile. The set was immaculate, the cameras perfectly positioned, and the audience sat in hushed anticipation. In that silence, the tension between them was almost tangible. Greg noticed the audience leaning forward, eager for what was about to unfold. He had a reputation for unsettling his guests, often tossing curveballs that left even the most prepared floundering. But tonight felt different. Something in Rachel's expression told him she might not be ready for what he had in store. "Tonight's show," Greg began, leaning forward slightly, his voice smooth and steady, "is going to be a discussion you won't want to miss. We'll cover everything from political correctness to the state of our leadership, and we'll see where it takes us. But first, let me ask you this, Rachel." Rachel straightened at the sound of her name, her lips parting, her posture stiffening. She was ready to deliver her usual sharp retorts, confident she could handle whatever Greg threw her way. But Greg, as always, had other plans. He continued with a calm yet pointed question that struck at the core of one of her key beliefs. It wasn't an outright attack, not yet, but it was a subtle challenge, setting the tone for what was to come. The audience leaned in, the energy intensifying. "Here's the question," Greg said, his gaze locked on Rachel's. "Do we truly believe that silencing those with opposing views is the path to progress, or does it merely stifle meaningful dialogue?" Rachel's expression faltered. For the briefest moment, for the first time that evening, her composure slipped ever so slightly. She knew this was one of those moments, a live broadcast, where every word carried weight. She tried to push back, to regain her footing, but it was already too late. Greg's question had landed, and it was about to set the stage for everything that followed. The tension in the room only grew thicker, and the countdown to the debate's turning point had begun. The atmosphere in the studio had shifted. What started as a routine exchange was quickly becoming something far more charged. Rachel's eyes narrowed as she straightened her back, adjusting her posture like a fighter, preparing to strike. She wasn't about to let Greg gain the upper hand, or so she told herself. "You're twisting my words, Greg," she snapped, her voice sharp, filled with the fire that had made her a prominent media figure. "What we need is a system that amplifies voices that have been marginalized for too long. It's not about silencing people. It's about creating space for those who've been ignored." Greg listened, his expression unflinching. He had heard this argument countless times before, in various forms, from various people. The rhetoric, the framing of the debate, it was all too familiar. But tonight felt different. Tonight, Rachel was on the defensive, and Greg knew it. He could see the cracks in her carefully constructed stance. She was trying to hold her ground, but the tension between them was mounting, and it was becoming increasingly obvious to everyone watching. Greg leaned in slightly, his calm demeanor unwavering. "You say it's not about silencing people?" he said, his voice almost a whisper, as if to ensure the audience was paying attention. "But what happens when the voices you champion start dictating what others can or cannot say? Doesn't that undermine the very idea of free speech?" Rachel's face flushed, the color rising in her cheeks as Greg's words hit their mark. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The silence between them was deafening. The audience held its breath, waiting for Rachel to recover. Her hand gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles white from the pressure. She was trying to regain control, to find her footing again, but Greg had already planted the seed of doubt. He knew the debate wasn't just about words, it was about power, influence, and the subtle art of steering a conversation. "I'm not twisting anything, Greg," Rachel finally managed, her voice louder now, more forceful. "You're just not listening. You're so focused on proving your point that you're missing the bigger picture." But Greg wasn't distracted. He had heard these arguments before and was ready to counter them point by point. His smile, that ever-present smirk, remained. He wasn't rattled. He wasn't even fazed. Rachel, on the other hand, was beginning to show signs of being out of her depth, and Greg knew exactly how to navigate these waters. "Maybe I'm not listening to your version of the bigger picture, Rachel," Greg replied, his voice steady and calm. "But that's the beauty of this country, isn't it? We all get to have a voice. We all get to disagree, even when we don't like what the other person has to say." Rachel's gaze hardened, but she knew she was losing ground. She could feel the control slipping through her fingers. Every word she spoke seemed to make things worse. Every defense she mounted only exposed her vulnerabilities more clearly, and Greg was relishing every moment of it. But with each exchange, the tension in the room continued to rise. The stage was set for what would come next, and neither of them knew just how far it would go. The tension in the studio was suffocating. Rachel inhaled sharply, her composure hanging by a thread. The fiery passion that usually fueled her arguments wasn't landing as it normally did. Her words, which once commanded attention, now felt weightless, slipping through the cracks like sand in an hourglass. And Greg knew it. The camera zoomed in, capturing every flicker of emotion on her face. The audience wasn't just watching a debate, they were witnessing a shift in power. Rachel adjusted her posture, leaned forward, and tried to reclaim the ground she was rapidly losing. "So what you're saying, Greg," she began, her voice tinged with frustration, "is that everyone should have an equal say, no matter how harmful their words might be. That people with platforms should be able to spread misinformation without facing any consequences?" Greg didn't hesitate, not for a second. His response was precise, surgical. "No, Rachel. What I'm saying is that your definition of harmful changes depending on who's speaking. And that's the problem." Rachel flinched, just slightly, but enough for anyone paying attention to notice. Greg let the words settle. He knew their weight. He knew their impact. He wasn't just speaking to Rachel. He was speaking to everyone watching. "See, the real issue here," he continued, leaning back casually in his chair, "is that people like you want to control the conversation, but disguise it as progress. If someone says something you don't like, suddenly it's misinformation. But when your side gets it wrong, when your narrative falls apart, somehow the rules change. You get to rewrite the definitions. You get to move the goalposts. And the second someone calls it out, you play the victim." The room fell silent. Rachel's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Greg tilted his head, his expression one of mild amusement. "And that's the real double standard, isn't it?" The air felt heavier. The audience shifted, murmurs rippling through the crowd. Rachel swallowed, her jaw tightening, as she struggled to formulate a response. She opened her mouth, paused, then closed it again. For the first time in the entire debate, she had nothing. Greg let the silence stretch. just long enough for everyone to realize what had just happened. Then, with perfect timing, he delivered the final blow. If free speech only works when you agree with it, Rachel, then it's not free speech, it's control. The reaction was immediate. A low murmur swept through the audience. The weight of those words settled in undeniable, irrefutable. Greg had flipped the entire conversation on its head. Rachel shifted in her chair, her fingers twitching against the table. Her confidence, once unshakable, was cracking in real time. She knew she had to say something, anything to regain control of the moment. But she also knew that anything she said now would feel like an afterthought. Greg had already won this round, but the real unraveling was only just beginning. The pressure was mounting, and Rachel was about to hit her breaking point.